following along from socioeconomic gradients, I can talk about 5 types of interventions. When I was involved with the Human Development Program for the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, we kept talking about universal versus targeted programs. And it really came from some of the ideas of Dan Offord, who is a child psychiatrist at McMaster University. And he felt that quite often, at least in his business, that most of the money was being spent on clinical interventions, that is, specialized programs for kids who have very severe problems, and not enough money spent on more universal interventions. Building on that work, I talked about 5 types of interventions that really use the gradient as a framework for thinking about what kinds of interventions might be useful in particular school systems. And I'm not saying any one type of intervention is better than another. I'm saying that you want to look at the gradient, you want to look at your school profile, and then decide what kind of a gradient is most appropriate. So here, I'm going to change the story a little bit, and instead of talking about PISA results in reading for students at age 15, I've got a measure of children's vocabulary development just as they enter elementary school. This is at age 5, as they enter kindergarten. And in this case, the outcome measure has an average of 100 and a standard deviation of 15. So about 2/3 of everyone is between 85 and 115, and 95% of everyone's between 70 and 130. And on the x-axis, I have a measure of socioeconomic status, which in this study was mothers and fathers' education, mothers and fathers' occupation, and family income. We actually asked families about their income. And it is also, like in the previous graphs, it has an average of 0 and a standard deviation of 1, so you can think about the 2/3, 95% going this way as well. So here's our gradient then, which for kids from very low socioeconomic families is down around an average of 85, and it rises up gradually. As you expect, more affluent families, their kids have better vocabulary scores when they enter kindergarten. On this measure, quite often a score of 85 is considered a vulnerability or an at-risk threshold, if you will. Children who enter school with scores below 85 on this test tend to have problems learning to read. They're more at risk of reaching the end of grade 2 or the end of grade 3 being struggling readers. Not always the case, but they're ones that we'd want to watch for. So one type of intervention then is what we'd call a performance-targeted intervention. You can imagine administering this test as kids enter kindergarten and saying what kids need some kind of intervention, and then you focus your, whether it's reading or whatever it is, your literacy intervention, you'd focus it on those kids who already demonstrated a low score on this outcome measure. When you do that, what happens is the learning bar raises up, and it also gets a little more level. Not so much at the right-hand side, because there are relatively few kids with very low scores on this measure of vocabulary, but more so amongst kids from poorer backgrounds. So it's both raising and leveling the learning bar. Another type of intervention is what we call SES, or socioeconomic status targeted intervention. This would be an intervention, for example, that was targeted particularly for kids who are living in poverty. In Canada, we generally talk about 1 in 6 children living in poverty. Some people use the 1 in 5 figure. But roughly speaking, it would be kids that are below more than 1 standard deviation below the average on this measure. So an SES targeted intervention would select those kids and give them some kind of special program. So for example, you might have a summer reading program that's means tested in some way, and say this is a special reading program for kids from poor families. And you'd give that intervention with the aim of improving their literacy scores. What that has the effect of doing is it kind of curls up the bottom of the gradient. It doesn't uniformly lift it, because there's a lot of vulnerable kids who aren't getting intervention. It's still arguably a good thing. Some people would say, well, you're spending resources with kids with very good scores, and maybe that's not a good thing. But even that's a value judgment, because quite often it's very good to have strong role models in here. And remember, although we've got some resilient kids, we don't have a lot of them who reach age 15 up in this area. So this is a good thing in most cases. And again, you want to look at what the distribution looks like in your particular school district or province or country. The next kind of intervention is a compensatory intervention. With a compensatory intervention, we're not trying to focus on any particular outcome, like reading scores or math scores or whatever it is. We're just saying we're going to try to abate the effects of poverty by giving some kind of compensation. So, for example, giving extra books to kids from poor families when they enter school, free lunch programs in the US, which are means tested. Certain kids get free lunch programs if their income's below a certain level. Or the most popular intervention in Canada is transfer payments to poor families, which has the effects of reducing some of the effects of poverty. Well, if you give a compensatory intervention, it isn't directed up this way trying to raise scores. It's just trying to move kids along. What happens is kids will move in this direction in their scores, but it's very difficult to move very far. You know, when you think of family incomes, say, below $25,000 being roughly the poverty level, nowadays they're talking about $30,000. If you could give families $5,000, which would be a lot in this government's terms, or in any government's terms, you might move them along this way, you know, about that much on the graph. It's very difficult to achieve a huge effect with a compensatory intervention. So you can hardly see it. What it has to do then is it brings the gradient line in, but it doesn't really raise it and level it. Now, when I presented this work before, I've had people say, Doug Wilms said we shouldn't give transfer payments to the poor. Doug Wilms says we shouldn't have free lunch programs. And I'm not saying that at all. No child should have to suffer the indignity of living in poverty. But I am saying don't expect it to raise and level the learning bar. You need to focus on with particular interventions aimed at improving kids' skills. Fourth intervention, universal interventions. Universal interventions are aimed at everyone. They're not targeted at any particular child. The recent initiative of this government of giving all parents of young children a $1,000 a year bonus in their income, that would be a universal intervention. It wasn't targeted at poor families or anything like that. An example I like to use is Sesame Street, which was designed some 30 years ago, TV program. It was designed actually to improve the literacy outcomes of kids from poor families, but of course because it's a TV program, it's universal in nature. The effects of a universal intervention, if all children benefit equally from it, it'll raise the bar, but it won't necessarily level it. And what's interesting with Sesame Street is that the universal intervention, it raised the bar, but it actually made it steeper. Kids from rich families tended to benefit more from the intervention than did children from poor families. And so they sent the ethnographers in to say, well, why is that? And what they found was that in families that had more financial resources, quite often the parents would sit down with the child and watch the show. They'd get to know who the characters are, and they'd use that language throughout the day, and it was being constantly reinforced. Whereas parents in poorer families usually didn't have that luxury because they're too busy with other things. And so the kid would be sitting there watching the show, still benefiting from it, but not benefiting as much as kids whose parents were involved with learning the language of the program and so on. I'm just going to return to the gradient for a minute using the PISA data. It's easier to talk about this last intervention with children at age 15 than with children entering school. The last intervention is about, it's called inclusive interventions. And we started with the gradient. Those are the dots for individual children. And then we moved to the dots for schools. Notice that in Canada, that if this is the poverty line here, we've got some schools where the average for the school is kids living in poverty. And these schools aren't far off that. One of the findings from PISA was that in every single country we looked at, without exception, when kids are concentrated in schools with other children from low socioeconomic status, they do worse than if they're mixed in terms of socioeconomic status and also mixed in terms of ability. In other words, when you concentrate poor kids together, they do a whole lot worse than they would if you have mixed ability or mixed socioeconomic status schools. So inclusive interventions is really about making sure that we don't concentrate kids in poor schools or in school programs within schools, that we achieve a better balance of kids across the ability range, across lines of across socioeconomic lines.